Hello, my name is Ed Tywoniak, Professor of Communication at St. Mary's College of California, and it's my good honor to welcome to St. Mary's the founder of the Media Ecology Association and a professor at Fordham University in New York, Professor Lance Straight. Lance, welcome to St. Mary's.
Thank you.
Let's start off by asking the broadest question, and for those who don't know about media ecology, tell us, what is media ecology?
Well, when Neil Postman introduced the term media ecology back in 1968, he explained that it was a field of inquiry, and I think that's important because nowadays the term has sort of worked its way into some popular discourse. A lot of journalists use it, and they talk about the media ecology, really where we would say the media environment, and that's not what we mean. So we're really talking about it as a field of study or a field of inquiry. And he defined it as the study of media as environments, which suggests that it is, first of all, a study of media, but a particular way to study media. But what goes along with that is that what we mean in media ecology, what we mean by media or a medium, has a much broader kind of definition or category than really in any other field. So it is best understood as an approach, a way of understanding the world. And I think of it as a way of understanding the human condition, particular way of studying ourselves. And I like the Douglas Adams phrase, life, the universe, and everything. People who do media ecology tend to go for the big picture. It's not absolute, not absolutely everyone, and not required, but for people who like to think about the big picture, all of human history, media ecology is a way to do that.
Neil Postman used oftentimes the metaphor of the petri dish and the nutrient agar as the medium, and that maybe talk a little bit about that as a metaphor.
Well, sure. I mean, that gets into the idea of medium as environment, that a medium is not simply a link or a pipeline where you send a message from one point to another point. And what usually went along with that way of looking at things is that the medium is an afterthought. It's like you have a source, and the source has a message that he or she wants to get out, and then they decide which medium. And that's really the wrong way to think about it. So Postman went back to biology to talk about the medium as agar that bacteria grow in, or an alternate example is how acidophilus grow in milk. The medium is what the bacteria grows in, and we call that batch of bacteria a culture. So a medium is what is the environment that a culture grows inside of. And that's different, and that's the opposite of the way many others look at it, where they think of culture as the environment and the medium situated inside the environment. We look at the medium as the environment. And Ted Carpenter said, that the way he looked at it was that media swallow cultures whole. And that's, I would go along with that. I would add to that when we're talking about media, we're really talking about the question of how, or the way that we do things, in the way that anything happens. That's really the fundamental underlying concept of what we mean by medium, so that how things happen, or how we do things, establishes the environment that we work within, or that we act within, or where that things happen within.
Postman is very much associated with media ecology, but the other person who is also credited with the fundamentals that undergird media ecology is Marshall McLuhan. Tell us a little bit of how Marshall McLuhan factors into the larger scope of media ecology.
Well, I begin by by noting that you can be a media ecologist and have absolutely nothing to do with McLuhan, or nothing to do with Postman. There's no one absolute required reading or required frame of reference. Aside from this basic understanding or sensibility or approach, a way of looking at things. But McLuhan, I think, would be the closest we get to a central thinker in media ecology. I think appropriately enough for McLuhan, he's a bit off-center. But I haven't actually done the research on this, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that understanding media is the single most often cited work in among media ecology scholars. So, and McLuhan wasn't the first. That's part of it. We go back further to Lewis Mumford, Harold Innis, to Edward Sapir. Depending on which direction you go in, Milman Parry and was another that McLuhan pointed to. Ultimately we get back to Plato's Phaedrus and even the Ten Commandments. So, and depending on how you look at it, by Moses or by God. So there's no definite point of origin, but when we get to McLuhan, and especially a little bit with his interaction with Walter Ong at St. Louis University in the 40s, but especially when he gets to the University of Toronto in the 50s and gets together with Edmund Carpenter and the Explorations group, that's when we get the first real coalescing of media ecology as a field, although they didn't use the phrase, but it's the first time that they're really getting the sense that there's a field there. And they're just bringing together people from all different areas, a real early example of a kind of interdisciplinary group. And when with the publication, really the Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media are kind of like a 1-2 combination. You get the first great synthesis of media ecology, of a media ecology approach. It's the beginning, and then others followed. I think, Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death has that synthesis, but it's not the entirety of the book. It's just a little bit of it, and then he gets into his own critical work. Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy doesn't do the field as a whole, but takes a big chunk of it and provides a synthesis of it. Joshua Myritz's No Sense of Place has a very particular focus on access to information and a social science, behavioral science approach, but again offers another kind of synthesis. And there have been others later on. Bolter and J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's Remediation takes another piece of it, but tries to put together a synthesis. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last period of time. And I think with Casey Lum's book, with perspectives on, do you remember Culture and Technology, and my own Echoes and Reflections, and then the book that I have coming out shortly, Media Ecology, An Approach to Understanding the Human Condition. Can I do the plug there?
Please.
Trying to get at, the next synthesis so that we can move forward. Not the final word. I don't think there will be a final word, but the next kind of synthesis for our time so we can move forward from there.
In the very first Media Ecology Convention in the year 2000 at Fordham University, Neil Postman gave the keynote address. And in it, he sets up a very interesting dichotomy between he and McLuhan, in which essentially he says McLuhan was happy probing the world, poking it and seeing what happened, and observing things. Postman, on the other hand, wanted to change the world. He wanted to be a difference that made a difference in some way, shape, or form. And he talks about that in his address. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and also talk about maybe the role of media ecology now as in part an activism type of activity in the
Okay.
contemporary age.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and McLuhan comes along and he says, I am not going to engage in moral evaluation. I'm just going to describe things. And I think one of the things he's reacting to, and as this becomes a problem in scholarship and thought generally, is that people say things because they're reacting to other things. Then time passes and they lose sight of what they're reacting to and just take that statement, it's sort of decontextualized, isolated, and becomes much more absolute. So I think when McLuhan first says this, and he says this in his first book, The Mechanical Bride, what he's reacting to are the folks, he's an English professor, and there's all these English literary types who are, still in this age of the elitist canon, and they're just saying, we don't even talk about these things like comic books and advertisements and later television. It is garbage. It is not worth our time. Even something like Sherlock Holmes, even in the literary world, it's just not something we discuss because it's beneath our notice. And so that was, McLuhan characterized that as a kind of moral indignation, at this crap that's out there. And he is saying, that this is a bad attitude because then you're not studying the stuff that's really going on and it's really having an impact on people. So he says, I am not going to take that attitude. I am going to, just sit back and study it. Now, and if you really look at what he's saying, especially in The Mechanical Bride, he is actually reflecting some of that elitist disdain and critical attitude towards popular culture. He's not completely immune from it, and he's got his comments. Even later on, they're coming up. But underlying it is the idea that we can't understand it if we start from a position where we're saying this is not worthy of our notice, this is beneath contempt, this is garbage, whatever. Then you can't even study it. You have to sort of be objective. You have to distance yourself and just study it. And this is the argument for all popular culture study, generally. And only then, when we really understand it, when we get that sort of objective, and I think even though he wasn't scientific per se, he did have the sense that people used to have of an objective reality. We can objectively understand this, then we can come to some conclusions afterwards. So I think people lose sight of that. And even Postman, and part of it was he was being playful, and noting the difference. But I think once you do understand it, then you can make an evaluation. And I remember there was an interview with McLuhan where he said, it was like one of the early ones, and he said, I don't know how to make a judgment about an entire age. That is this a better age than, a century ago or a worse one? And if we had to do it now, we would have to say, well, and following along Postman's view that there are a lot of negative things that are happening. People aren't reading as much. They're not reading in depth. Donald Trump is president. We've got this sort of celebrity image politics going on. There's a lot of stuff that's really making us uncomfortable. And yet, on the other hand, civil rights, right? Women's rights, gay rights. Things have really, just people have become much more liberated. There's much more freedom and equality in our society. We've made tremendous progress from when we were kids, right? It's extraordinary what happened over the last half century or so. So how do you say it's good or it's bad? There is a point to that. However, Postman was willing to say, and I think McLuhan was too, but he tended to do it privately, express this more privately. But Postman was willing to say, look, yes, there's a good and a bad. There's advantages and disadvantages. But if all we hear about are how great everything is, which is what we tend to get because it goes along with advertising and promoting all this stuff. If all we get is the positive, we're not able to evaluate things properly, and we need to balance that out with a critical attitude. So that's where he says, and his whole emphasis has been on moral evaluation to understand things in ethical and moral framework. And I think that's right. I mean, we have to start with the question, where do you stand? Mm-hmm. What's important? For Postman, it was, this sort of humane life. And so if your use of the cell phone is not contributing to making your life more human, then maybe that's a problem. We need to have an ethical framework. Ultimately, and I don't think Postman and McLuhan were as far apart as Neil made it out to be back then. And I think he knew that himself, or that many other people have made it out to be. They're not that far apart. In media ecology, to get at the second part of your question, when Postman started a media ecology program at NYU, one of his ideas was it would be like Nader's Raiders, which I don't know how many people would be aware of it who are younger than us, but Ralph Nader came to prominence as a consumer advocate, and he had a group of young college students who went out and did research and looked at the world and came up with the factual information that say seatbelts save lives. And given that information, cars ought to all have seatbelts, which was something that didn't happen until they came out with this information. So the idea of a kind of intervention, now it's there in McLuhan too, and he was criticized for it because he said some unfortunate things at a time when most people weren't really thinking too much about it. The comment about cooling down tribal tensions in South Africa. In 1964, most people would not, think too much about it, but later on, when apartheid becomes a real issue. He is talking about manipulating, programming the environment towards certain purposes. Now, he didn't say what the purposes were, but the kind of implied purpose was government keeping the peace, if you like, within a population. Mm-hmm. Which, that understanding could have come in handy when we occupied Baghdad and Iraq. And I'm sure that, there are different points of view on even the amount of resistance that was faced, but it might have reduced some of the violence had they taken that into account. But apart from that, I think the activist, view, we could go to others. Jacques Ellul is a great example of this, of someone who was active as a theologian, but also as a politician, as a leader, trying to make the world better based on his media ecological understanding of the world. Buckminster Fuller is an interesting case, in that regard. Can we come up with alternate structures, alternate ways of organizing our physical reality as well as ourselves personally?
One of my favorite quotes from Buckminster Fuller is, if the world depended upon what you thought and what you did, what would you think and what would you do? Mm. And that's, I think, a powerful resonance for us in the age we live in.
Yeah.
Neil Postman was the editor of Etc., a review of general semantics, for 10 years.
Right, now you are.
And now I am. Is
my, how things have gone downhill.
Alfred Korzybski, the founder of general semantics, did his ideas in some way, shape, or form, frame Postman's outlook towards the world, to the violence in the world and the things that go on in the world?
Well, he certainly was influenced by Korzybski. I think at one point he said he read Science and Sanity 3 times. But Postman was introduced to general semantics by S.I. Hayakawa, because his first year as an academic was at San Francisco State, and he was in the English department there with Hayakawa. And I think he had more affinity for Hayakawa's brand of general semantics. When Postman was editor of Etc., it was the Journal of the International Society for General Semantics, which was Hayakawa's group, where the Institute of General Semantics was Korzybski's group. And there's a difference between Korzybski's followers being more hardcore, where Hayakawa, they were academics and interested in other things aside from general semantics. But for us, first of all, and I think also Postman's doctoral work with Louis Forsdale, and also had a lot of emphasis on language in other ways. So I think for Postman, mainly Korzybski and general semantics represented an emphasis on language, and and certainly Wendell Johnson was very important for Postman. And it's the idea of language being used clearly and accurately to make sensible statements about the world. And we used in our doctoral seminar, we had people in quandaries, and it had a kind of double role, because one role was that you should be familiar with general semantics, because that's part of media ecology. But the other role was that understanding concepts such as abstracting and reification and idealization and the need for operational definitions was really important as scholars. You know, we got to figure out what we're talking about, and we got to understand that when in scholarship you have discussions of key terms, those terms may need to be defined. And if they're not, and that was why Postman didn't like French writers so much, because they'd just be on and on about whatever it is, you know, freedom, existence, you know, whatever, you know, and without ever defining it. So what are we talking about?
Right. Yeah.
And I found that very useful myself. In End of Education, Postman points to 3 kind of linguistic elements. You know, one is definitions. Things should be clearly defined, but how we define things determines how we see things. Another was metaphors, which is a way of defining things. You know, the metaphors we use, and this goes into like Lakoff and Johnson's work. Metaphors are color the way we understand things, the way we experience the world. And questions, which was Postman's great point. You know, the questions we ask have a lot to do with the answers that we get.
It says a lot about our worldview, too.
Yeah.
I don't ask things that aren't in my worldview.
Yeah. Yes, Suzanne Langer, I mean, the beginning of philosophy in a new key, she says every age has its own questions that define that age. And, you know, and her example, the one example she uses is if you ask the question, who made the world? Right, you're already presupposing a certain answer,
yeah.
Right, and if you say, well, nobody did, then that's like a rejection of the question. That's not an answer.
Right.
Who?
Right.
Who did it? Right? My favorite though is Postman's anecdote in Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk, where he talks about the apocryphal village, where they realized, this is, you know, centuries ago, they realized that sometimes people appeared to be dead, but then would sort of come out of it, and so they're afraid that they might be burying someone who really wasn't dead yet. So the question was, how can we make sure that everyone we bury is dead? So they put a stake in the lid of the coffin so that when they closed the, the door, it went through the person's heart.
We're going to make sure they're dead.
Right, right. And I use that as an example of asking the wrong question.
Now, you were fortunate to have studied with Neil at New York University in the media ecology program that he founded.
Yes.
What was that like back then with Neil?
Well, I started with him in 1980, and I've often pointed to, that there was a big difference between that period, from that period forward, and the first decade from, it technically started in 71, although there were students who had been with him prior to that program's establishment, but, who were his students. I think many of the students, the doctoral students from the 70s, wanted to be McLuhan. Right? McLuhan was their model, and they saw Postman. It was almost like he was like young at that point. He was kind of like a big brother. So he wasn't what they aspired to. He was more like someone who would help them take a step up to that. But at some point became almost like a rival. Wow. If they were able to get far enough. But starting in 1980, that's right when McLuhan passed away, and at the same time, really starting in 79, that's where Postman rises to prominence as a major kind of pundit, quoted in papers and appearing on TV to talk about television. So to the 80s generation, Postman was the model, and people wanted to be like Postman. But it was really a great education. I think part of it also was that the 70s, they were looser, and they did creative projects and that sort of thing. By the 80s, they really became more established and more rigorous. And a lot had to do with Christine Nystrom's influence. Because in the 70s, she was still at the beginning of the 70s, she's a student who then becomes a professor, but she's very much settled in by 1980, and we would do a book a week. A lot of students found that challenging, but it was great, so what if you don't finish it, or you skim it, right? It's a great discipline, and the first semester we did nothing related to what most people would say is media. Right? We did information theory and cybernetics. We did language, general semantics, symbols, signs and symbols, systems theory. We did all these kind of things, relational communication and symbolic interaction. And it was great books. This was their view, the great books. It's not about the most recent stuff, it's about the stuff that's really great. So we did George Herbert Mead from the 30s, and Ogden and Richards, The Meaning of Meaning from the 20s. We read Benjamin Lee Whorf's book from a collection of articles from the 50s. And these are the things, and Wendell Johnson from the 40s. But these are the great books that really were worth discussing. And then we had these seminars, which were great, and we would just talk a lot. I think Postman always felt it was a good class when there was a lot of discussion. Personally, I felt there was a little bit too much of the discussion. I didn't always want to hear what my classmates thought. I wanted to hear what Postman thought, but Nystrom always tried to push it toward a more of a structure and to at least include a period of time where they say, this is what's important, this is what you should know. There was a wonderful foundation.
The program at NYU currently doesn't exist anymore as a formal PhD program.
Well, there is a PhD program. It's no longer a media ecology program. They went over to a different orientation.
And the legacy that Postman left behind is now found in the Media Ecology Association.
Right.
And when did that start, and a little bit about that early history of Media Ecology Association?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, part of it was sensing that this wouldn't go on forever. Um, and, that we needed to do some things to preserve the legacy. Part of it was also that media ecology had become, I think when Postman started it, there were other places they were picking up, up on it, you know, but after a time it became so singularly identified with NYU, and it that other people were not. It was not a point of identification for other people who were basically doing media ecology, and so there was a need for something that was independent of any one university. Um, to try to establish it. I mean, it was also it was so problematic because as graduate student, starting with my master's in the late '70s and then through the '80s, and the received wisdom was don't mention media ecology. Right? And there's no interest in it. There's no sympathy for it out in the world. There's no place to publish an article about media ecology in an academic journal. Don't mention McLuhan above all. Right? McLuhan was verboten. If you mention McLuhan when you're being interviewed, you won't get hired. If you cite McLuhan, you won't get published. I mean, this was what had happened. And I never, I heard that and I didn't quite go along with it. I mean, I just didn't really accept it. Or I wasn't willing to just do that, to just not talk about those things. But we did recognize there was a need to sort of create, I hate to use the phrase, but a safe space. And to try to work to establish media ecology as a perfectly legitimate area of scholarship. And how do you do that? It's the old labor union thing. You organize. And this was essentially what it was. I guess we could have called it the union of affiliated media ecologists or whatever. But this is the way to really kind of band together for mutual protection, but also to establish legitimacy. And so for a long time, we had talked about it as we, I'm talking about myself, particularly myself, Tom Gencarelli, and Casey Lum, because we were having these conversations, because we were going out to these other organizations, to the National Communication Association, and locally to the New York State Communication Association, and I guess the Eastern Communication Association. So we're seeing that these associations serve a certain function. And we say we need something like this for media ecology, because you can't go into and especially in those days, those communication organizations were dominated by speech people. So forget media ecology, just media was really kind of pushed back. And there were mass communication scholars, but the people who were interested in media, were not really allowed into the leadership positions, and again, so it was very, very hard. So we decided, we were talking about, that this is something that we should do. And I think it was around '94, somewhere in that time period, where there was an Eastern Communication Association conference in Baltimore, and I organized a roundtable on media ecology at that meeting. So a bunch of us discussed it, and out of that, Stephanie Gibson set up the first media ecology discussion list, email discussion list. And then I started to just email people and invite them to join, and so we got people, it started to grow and grow, and that became the first basis for organizing. And there were other things that contributed to it. Our activity with locally with the New York State Communication Association, and where we also learned a bit about leadership from that. I started the first media ecology book series with Hampton Press after working on an anthology through another book series with them and getting to know the publisher, who was very personable and was very much a mom and pop organization publisher, so I could get to know her. And I just said, how about this? And there was a time when she was like, sure, let's do it. So I started a media ecology book series, and really in this time it was still not sure. I was still questioning, what should we call what we're doing? Should we call it media ecology? Because we had qualms about it. You know? I mean, people saw it as sort of trendy, capitalizing on 1970s Earth Day, Greenpeace, or whatever. And I'm glad we didn't change it. I'm glad we stuck with it, because it turns out that environment piece and the ecological idea is very important. But at the time, it was still up in the air. And really the kind of like the moment that led up to forming MEA was that the spring of '98, I had run a McLuhan Symposium. So I mean, the year before I was organizing it, and it was this really big event. Tom Gencarelli calls it the MEA Convention #0. But it was a big event. I had like 40 different participants, and really just, I had Jerome Agel, and he wasn't able to come. He had like the flu, and he wasn't able to come. But we just talked on the phone a lot, because he heard I was doing this, and he got in touch with me, and he said, you should ask this guy, and you should ask that guy, and here's somebody else. So he really contributed a lot to it, and it became this major event. I think it made, Elena Lamberti says it started the McLuhan Renaissance revival. I think it was starting before then, but I think we really did help it along quite a bit. And there was, I think, maybe 300 people came to it over 2 days. And everyone who came, it was free. I mean, I got like good funding. We had good like food and drink and all that. But everyone had to fill out a registration form. So we developed a mailing list, and that September was that's when I said, I think now is the time to do it. So it was on September 4th, where Casey Lum, Tom Gencarelli, and then Susan B. Barnes, who was my colleague at Fordham at the time, we decided we would meet on September 4th in the conference room in our building, Faculty Memorial Hall, 4th floor conference room, to talk about and really with the intent to establish MEA. And I'd been department chair at that time and had just hired Paul Levinson at that moment on a temporary full-time kind of fill-in. And he happened to be there at that moment, so we said, yeah, come on, sit in with us. And so the 5 of us sat down, and we just sort of like yacked and talked about it a bit, and then we got to the point where we say, we hereby declare the formation of the Media Ecology Association. And we created this sort of temporary offices and took it from there.
One of the nice phrases I love from the Media Ecology Association is that it's, when they gather every year, it's not a conference, it's a convention. It's not a conferring of anything or conferring about anything, it's a convening of the tribe.
Right.
And it really has that feeling to it. St. Mary's College is real fortunate this year in June to be hosting the 18th convening of the tribe.
Yes, you are very fortunate.
Yes, indeed.
And so are we.
And the theme, technology, spirituality, and ecology.
That's a good theme, don't you think?
It's a brilliant theme, in large part developed by yourself. But the theme itself is drawing on the contemporary writing of the current Pope and Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, where much of it's like it's written by Neil Postman, talking about the confluence of technologies and systems and the question of spirituality and how these various influences are not only powerful in our life but in the life of the planet. And so it very much is ecological as we look at our symbolic environments.
Yeah.
And so we're real excited about that happening this June. To conclude, moving forward as media ecology continues after this coming June and beyond, you mentioned your new book. And what are some of the things that you're looking at in your new book that can show us sort of where media ecology might be going in the near future?
Well, this is a book that, in a sense, I was working on or really not working on for 20 years. 20 years ago, I was when I started the book series, I said I would do my own book on media ecology and provide a sort of topical introduction to it or an overview of it. And then I never got around to it in one sense. I mean, I did do the massive review of the literature that started out as it took up an entire issue of the journal Communication Research Trends, and then became a major part of the book, my book Echoes and Reflections. So I did get that part of it, but that was just like a piece of it. And really the book I would have written 20 years ago would have been very different from the book I wrote now. But I did try to, in this book, try to provide a synthesis of it, so that it's not, this is what McLuhan said, this is what Mumford said, this is what Innes said. I mean, it's woven in there, but it tried to put it together as one piece. So I talk about media ecology. I go back to that basic definition, the study of media as environments, and understanding that. Understanding that it is an approach, right? That it's a way of looking at things, a way of understanding and studying things. And that's different from a field, because, or the way I'm trying to look at it before was trying to look at it before, is that it's a field with all, an interdisciplinary field with all these different points of view. Here I'm trying to put together that there is a common approach here about understanding the human condition. That's the big picture quality to it. And in particular, I came to that there are four main concepts in media ecology. One is the idea of a medium, which I mentioned before. I mean, a medium in media ecology is a much broader category of phenomenon. And I don't think you want me to go into the whole kit and caboodle of it, but it also includes an idea of a relationship. I call it an asymmetric sort of relationship, dialectic grammar. I mean, it's a mix of both, where you have the medium and what it contains. And that can be applied to any kind of phenomenon. So there's medium, there's the concept of bias. Every medium has a bias. And actually in working that out, it's really not bias in the sense of, political bias or class bias. It's tendency. Right? When you have a hill, it has a bias. Things on a hill have a bias towards rolling down the hill. That's what we mean. And that's the original meaning of bias. Bias and inclination, right? I mean, you look at the words, a slant, right? I mean, they really do talk about they really do refer back to this basic thing. There's a tendency, right? And it has a tendency to be hard. Other kinds of materials have a tendency to be soft. So there's bias, then effects, which is like our main interest. We're not just interested in the medium, but in its effects on us as individuals, collectively, on human history. And we sort of shy away from effects sometimes, because that I mean, I try to deal with the whole straw man argument about determinism, which and this is where things like formal cause and emergence and systems theories come in. But I think we really are talking about effects. But it's the effects, in the same way that the environment has effects on the living things inside the environment, and the interaction of those things have effects on the interactants, right? Their effects is the big, a really big thing. So medium, bias, effects, and then finally environment. So what do we mean by environment, and what is an ecological approach to understanding things? So there's that, and I also try to summarize the different kind of, if you like, models, tools, ways of approaching the research or study of media ecology. So that's what I'm trying to do. As I said, I think we periodically need to establish a synthesis, that can, and I'm sure people disagree with it and want to do other things, but I mean, it gives us a kind of point to move forward from.
Mm-hmm. And again, lastly, as we move forward, do you think the media ecology research that's being done now will help us somehow try to better understand the world we live in, as we look at things like fake news, as we look at global warming and some of these very
Sure.
real issues? Are there things that will come from these studies that might help some of these situations?
Well, if not, then we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's not simply, I mean, understanding is the beginning, but hopefully it'll give us the understanding we need to, if not solve the problems, at least mitigate the negative consequences of what's happening, and provide us with a basis for evaluating what we're doing. I mean, that is certainly the hope, and I think it has the potential not only to help us understand media as we understand, but to understand every aspect of our environment, and that includes the communication aspect, the use of symbols. It includes technology in the more general sense, all human invention and innovation, and includes the natural environment, the biophysical environment. I mean, it is a way of looking at the natural environment. I know we're not supposed to use that word natural, but the biological, chemical, and physical environment, and I think it can provide a way for scientists to better understand their work. And depending on your point of view, you might say there's an even greater environment of some spiritual nature, and it certainly provides a way of understanding that as well.
Lance, thank you so much for being here. This
My
was great.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.